From round cities to space rings. Antonio.P. Copyright author, layout, and cover design. Antonio.P. Published in July 2011. Foreword. With this book the reader pretend to accompany me on an interesting journey through space and time, trying to understand how it could be the process of evolution of humanity. In an effort of imagination united to a thorough scientific analysis, I have tried to approach as much as possible the world that could find us in the coming centuries. Since my childhood, I felt a keen interest in scientific issues. For me were something more than a mere collection of ideas, lived as if they were part of me. I felt the feeling of having a special facility to find possible solutions to problems scientists. By studying science and thorough analysis of it, I developed a number of ideas that were implemented in this book, i.e., I have not sought simply to define what the world of the future based on the scientific conclusions reached so far, but rather I have gone further and I tried to find those points that mainstream science does not show in order to add something positive to your progress. I have also proposed trying to clarify what the first steps of the universe in its infancy and what their end, in many respects from a philosophical or metaphysical point, but my understanding is this science, philosophy, which contribute more to society in the future, because from my point of view it is the most difficult and the least developed. Although only part of scientific theories raised in this book were true, and only thus would have added a bit to the progress of humanity. This book has been translated from the original Spanish version. Chapter 1, The Progress of Cities. The first cities. Since time immemorial, mankind has sought the best way to protect yourself from problems such as weather, animal attacks, and attacks from other human communities. Also to develop the first mode of trade and have those close by. As a result arose the first cities, which in this case could best be called villages. At first the houses were being built in an impromptu manner, going in a number of low to high, generally in the course of rivers, but there was no urban planning that delimit in the most appropriate location of the buildings. An old housing destroyed and instead other more modern type was constructed, but not coordinated with each other. In the future this will change. Cities will be planned from the beginning, just as a car is designed, not as an individual thing but as a whole, also joined in these cities. Conventional materials such as cement and bricks will be replaced by more easily recycled as glass, plastic or metal. Classical city. The classical city could be defined as the result of a housing association that eventually went on to become a cluster of buildings, while retaining the characteristic of individual buildings made on a horizontal plane, which grew into the vertical. Thus each building became a smaller micro-city. The main drawback of such cities is that although each building provides its tenants a protection from the weather, that advantage is broken when they have to leave to go to another. This would be solved if a marriage brokers or believe among all city buildings and thus allow citizens to safeguard the various climate changes such as rain, snow, or wind. The best design for a city in my view would be to round type, so the city is projected towards all directions equally. On its periphery airports would be installed and everything connected with them. In the center of the city, government buildings and administrative. The roads consist of roads that divide the city circle in grids, so vertical and horizontal if seen from above. Each division would form a neighborhood in the cities of the future. Private car, it could be replaced by an extensive transport network. Public, which could well be formed by conventional buses, or 1-meter network type circulating on rails, or both. This mission would alleviate the presence of traffic, while achieving significant energy savings. All vehicles circulate in a plane other than pedestrian in order to avoid abuses, but they would not beneath the earth, since that, while useful, is the result of a sort of improvised and unplanned city. Rather the base plane would leave for pedestrians and public transport routes would be placed in a higher background. In order to avoid accidents, vehicle access areas as platforms would be completely separate from citizens and could only be accessed through automatic gates once arrested. The risk of objects falling from buildings be solved by these having an outer shell and separate fixed pedestrian areas. In a developed society would not exist strikes in vital services, because the nature of a strike is to respond to an individual problem of a company, but a particular interest cannot hinder the progress of the rest. Strikes wild type more have to do with terrorist behavior with legitimate claims, The problem is that some governments are not able to distinguish one from the other, give prevalence to the right to strike for the right to move or otherwise. So things like health, army, police, political and transport, have not recognized this right, being considered vital services, but in return the government would establish a program to pay, or regular meetings with their representatives they do not feel disadvantaged. These rights would be recognized by law unlike other trades. The cities would form a perfect circle, would have a diameter of about 5 kilometers, and all the cities on the planet would be virtually identical. Each building would be like a micro-world with its own particularities. Some poses the perfect city as an association of chalets, but my understanding is formed by buildings better, since it gives greater protection to its inhabitants, as well as to place all the elements of it closer. A city of small houses devour all the space available, in addition to larger distances that would separate each element of urbanization, so would not be appropriate. Airports or bases aircraft would be in the periphery but not far from the cities. This is because in the future all aerial vehicles take off vertically, as the use of the wings gradually disappear to be replaced aircraft by vehicles vertical takeoff. These vehicles will not be helicopters, as its engine system will be hidden in the fuselage. Thrusters, turbine rotating or fixed type but with flaps to deflect the jet propulsion, will be responsible for supporting the aircraft in the air without need to use wings. 4 or more motors will be controlled by a gyroscope and thus will avoid the accidents caused by wind gusts or fog during takeoffs and landings. The city's dome. One of the biggest problems of cities is caused by inclement weather. One of the most effective methods of protection may be building domes that would cover around its exterior, so it would not matter what place were situated cities, since they would be protected from the various temperatures and atmospheric conditions. With the use of these domes, cities that we might call dome cities, would be prepared to live even on the moon and planets. They no longer have the disadvantage of temperature or lack of oxygen, which is common in these places. The only problem would be the risk of fracture of the dome that would expose people to the original climate in these worlds, and the consequent change in atmospheric pressure. Make airtight buildings could prevent such situations for buildings, but not outside. The compact city. In my view, this whole process of evolution would lead to the emergence of a kind of city we would call compact city, i.e. a city that would result from the merger of all buildings in the same, creating a single structure. So no, it would be necessary to use a dome as a means of insulation against the weather, as the city would be an integral whole in which a building would end where started the other. So this type of cities would be extremely robust and cannot be affected even by the earthquakes. And retain an internal microclimate, would keep all the cities on the planet at the same temperature. Live again, the experience of a snowfall or a blizzard would form part of the holiday more than the rhythm of everyday life. Arguably the characteristics of these cities roughly be: its diameter would be about 5 kilometers, the height of 100 meters in most of its length, and the central area would have a dome with windows that could reach 250 meters high. From these windows, citizens could see the horizon in his spare time. Serious side view is a rectangle with a dome on its top side. On the outskirts, hangars for aircraft occupy virtually the entire circumference of the city. These ships would be the most frequent means of communication with the rest of the planet, and travel in this way would be shorter, would fall. The ships would not need large airports to land, would approach the hangars describing a circular path, and once by the assigned would be addressed to him in front and to land smoothly. These hangars would not be on the floor but on the sides of the city, occupying each of its plants. From a distance, these cities have a multicolored image due to the large number of lights that emerge from the hangars that surround the windows and the central dome. Across the planet Earth could have 1,000 of these cities with 10 million inhabitants. City. On the lower floors would move urban transport vehicles, above them would have pedestrian areas, pedestrian zones, and factories and offices. On these private homes, the central dome would be reserved for government buildings and city administration. In these cities nothing be wasted, and all citizens' waste would be recycled and reused. Thus the cities need no longer be in the vicinity of rivers as before, but the recycling process would go beyond the collection and treatment of, and therefore waste from production would be regulated for recycling. For example, you could ban the use of glass for packaging food or drink, unless there is a commitment collection. As for green areas, these would place mainly outside the city, which would be mostly urban, but a nice way to live. Whereas populated areas have been together almost exclusively in cities, except for places for tourism and recreation, it is logical that parks are installed on the outer fields to them. Question: Funeral. Since ancient times, humans have been in the habit of burying their deceased loved ones in cemeteries or other means and gather in extensive grounds called cemeteries. The reason is the widespread belief since ancient times of possible resuscitation of the body in the near future. In my view, an evolved society cannot afford to allocate space their cities for these purposes. It is much more practical and reasonable to opt for incineration and leave so that the soul of the deceased continue its path toward the there unhindered. Is a fallacy. Build cities for the dead, for they are no longer among us physically. Our bodies were formed from matter, and matter must return, and thus the ashes also must return to the natural environment which they left. In my opinion, the spirit of the deceased will continue its path towards a new reincarnation in a new body, and life process will start again. Chapter 2, Craft. Craft, VDV. In advanced societies, most predictable is the disappearance of classic aircraft and helicopters to be replaced by VDV, i.e. vehicles vertical takeoff, driven by turbine engines or propellers. These vehicles would no longer need long runways to take land. Camouflaged fuselage lead 4 rotating turbines least that would land vertically to eject the jet propulsion gases downwards, and the air would be placed horizontally in order to advance. These aircraft would not have the classic wings because you no longer need to get the elevator drive, but they would have what might be called half wings. It is a side fuselage like wings, but thicker and less wide, would not be aimed at raise the device, but rather to other purposes such as transportation fuel. However, once it achieved cruising speed averages, wings could help maintain stability. The advantages of these types of devices are huge compared to previous ones, since they can land anywhere easily, do not have to carry the annoying blades of the helicopters, which sometimes collide with objects, missing the lifting force, and can reach speeds above aircraft. The fuel may be both chemical and electrical, being used either as a function of the most appropriate circumstances. These vehicles would be balanced by gyroscopes that would trigger all engines, being able to travel even on autopilot, pilots in charge of the general controls alone. To avoid accidents in case of system failure, could lead lift is installed parachutes on top or even additional emergency engines. These ships would agree on the sides of the hangars, and cities would make it very easy travel and freight. Craft depot majority. With this name I mean the ships whose fuel zone would represent most of its structure in order to make a trip to space or the stars without resorting to cumbersome stages. Thus, the ships take off the spaceport and would consume their fuel to reach space. This system is more expensive fuel than stages, but would the easiest travel by not having to organize control them. Anyway, at the moment of takeoff could be used atmospheric engines, which would use the oxygen in the air and reduce the fuel needed for the trip. The area for passengers would be at the head of the ship, and in case of accident would be separated from the rest and can land in an autonomous way. The fuel used would preferably oxygen and hydrogen, obtained by hydrolysis from the seawater. Craft interstellar. In order to get the trip without resorting to steps and preserving the entire structure of the ship intact, interstellar ships would also be of major deposit, consume 2/3 of the fuel in the process of acceleration and the remaining third in the braking process, using nuclear fission reactors, would get the energy required for propulsion and consumption of its occupants. In interstellar travel it would not be possible to use solar energy, being the ships too far from the stars. The propulsion system would be based on the use of gases heated to 10,000 degrees or greater. Ship would provide a big boost with spending reduced reaction mass and thus would remove the most of it. One could also use a propulsion system cold. The reaction gases in this case would drive at high-speed devices and particle accelerators. Same result would be achieved. The fuselage would be light enough to achieve lower energy cost and speed for months, to minimize forces, i.e. acceleration forces, thus need a lighter and easier to transport infrastructure. The dimensions of these ships could be from several hundred meters to several kilometers, these being authentic spaceships, cities that could be in space for centuries, being the living conditions at unbeatable on board and no worst case the planet. In these ships would follow generations and their children would quite naturally until they reach their destination, so they could be called generational ships. In my opinion, the propulsion system used in the future will be preferably based on the action and reaction mass, as other assumptions about propulsion systems seem less convincing, because this is the only method that has been used in the animal kingdom through evolution, and do not forget that animals have many features in common with the machines, albeit in an organic way. This propulsion system would provide high-speed ships, but not more than 15% of the speed of light. Within solar systems, ships would not be majority but conventional deposit, and energy would be nuclear but solar. It is less dangerous and inexhaustible. Floating craft. The more atmospheric pressure has a planet, more interesting is the use of floating ships. These ships have a lower density than the surrounding air and thus manage to remain there indefinitely, are arguably as airships, as have many things in common with them. For example, a mother ship that was built to be always without descending to ground could be quite economical, since it could serve as atmospheric currents for movement and not even have to consume energy, as in the case of being coated with a photosensitive material such as solar panels, would collect the sun's energy that would be more than enough for the development of their travels. The interior of these vessels would be coated with helium gas, as this is a very light and harmless gas, and at the bottom the living quarters, fuel, batteries, and goods would be located, except the command area might be as in a normal ship. There may also be ships with variable density to descend to Earth with ease. In my opinion, this is the system used by some of the so-called flying saucers. From a relatively rigid but lightweight fuselage, the ship almost empty inside, instead of helium use the atmospheric gas, just as balloons hot air. Heating the indoor air, the apparatus, and reduce its density float, could also help of a propeller system to increase its buoyancy. The energy generated would cause the typical brightness that is characteristic of these devices. When the ship would rise, heat the interior and start to glow, then the air would start to go for about spillways, just as does a submarine when its density is lower than the surrounding air float. The reverse process when he wanted to land, would let the cool outside air and then descend. A thermal heat conservation system, allow the spaceship to maintain high over long periods with a reduced consumption, may also help of a photosensitive surface to collect solar energy. The drawback of these devices would be its limited payload capacity, being more suitable for use as ship's observation, for example. Its fuel would be hydrogen and preferably electric batteries. Launch pads. Ecuador in planetary space launch stations would be located, because in this place gravity is lower and therefore less fuel needed to launch the craft into space. To make the process easier, you could use the so-called turntables launch. These platforms would remain in a horizontal position until the ship's to land on its surface, and then would turn to stand upright with the ship subject to the platform, then begin filling the fuel needed for the trip. Once the ship took off, the platform would recover its initial position. Ship taking off vertically, the main engines could stand behind, thus making the complexity and weight of the hull is less. Shuttle. In my view, one of the defects of the reusable American shuttle consists in the fact that it is this which transport the fuel tank is much higher and not vice versa. This causes an increase of weight in the structure and consequently a greater risk to the spacecraft during re-entry. The increase in weight, resulting in a temperature higher friction, resulting in danger in case of merger of the hull. This would have been solved by installing engines at all stages and making them all reusable. Another positive step would be to use the unmanned craft only for passenger transport, to avoid unnecessary risks. Arguably, the American shuttle only lacked the final conclusion of its design to be sufficiently effective. Lunar launch catapults. In the world's no atmosphere like the Moon, the most appropriate to send a ship into space would be electromagnetic launch catapults. These devices accelerate ships to speed orbital release. Upon returning to land, the energy used for launch it would be recovered in the braking process. With the use of these catapults, loss of gas or reaction mass would be avoided, and thus the space would be cleaner and would not be necessary to replenish the gases, which would be costly. Laser craft. A more convenient way to ascend to the space is the use of laser ships. These ships operate in association with another satellite in spaceship located about 100 kilometers. Laser ship, off the ground in a conventional manner, using its own energy system to reach sufficient altitude to the presence of clouds could not interfere with the action of the laser, then the satellite spacecraft would launch a low-power laser that used as a linking element to the other. Once it had established the link and lightning fall-on energy collector mechanism, the second laser, the high-power infrared type, is activated. The laser system would be controlled by computers and nothing else start the process. All controls including steering ship would be under computer control in order to prevent the laser being diverted from its route. The beam would impact on the mechanism and energy collector converge in the combustion chambers of the turbine, reheated and air would behind accelerating the craft to the required speed. Once the vessel was about to leave the atmosphere, disconnect the laser system and would use the conventional propulsion system based on hydrogen and oxygen or other. Another advantage of this system is that energy would lift the space provided by the satellite ship turn the pick of the sun, which would be a big savings for the planet. To avoid risks, some equatorial corridors for the use of these laser satellites would be reserved. This could become the most common transportation system in the future, as well as energy savings would climb into space without much effort for engines, to do without heavy fuel tanks also need less acceleration. These vessels could be used only on those planets with an atmosphere sufficiently transparent so that the laser can act, otherwise would have to resort to conventional ships. Craft stages. Elected the option of using stages for flights into space, ideally using a system based on the use of two main stages system. The first would have the mission to transport fuel and make the main effort to install the ship in space, and the second stage would be formed by the main ship which in turn carry the payload. These two vessels would be separated as they approach the space. The ship fuel would not manned and return to its base in an automatic manner once separated from the main ship. This stage power turn could be aided by other propellants which would be installed on the sides. The use of steps to travel into space would reduce the amount of fuel needed, but in return, would be a more cumbersome and less simple than the majority system reservoir system, difficulties in recovering stages once separated from the main nave. Of used stages in interstellar travel, these are also divided into two as in the previous case, be responsible for accelerating the main ship to cruise, and once got the two ships would separate and fuel second only would use for the braking process, once the ship arrived at its destination. Chapter 3, Space Cities. So far, we have only taken into account the influence of climatic type that could affect humans in the future in the normal development of their city life, but we have not taken into account another problem that future generations will have to face, and is the problem of gravity. There are worlds like Jupiter whose gravity is unbearable, and others like the Moon is so poor that serves neither to walk in an acceptable way. For possible colonization of other worlds like the Moon or Mars, one possible solution could be the use of space cities. Developing an orbit around the planet, they would be able to create artificial gravity to your own taste, no having to rely on the whims of each world. In addition, they should not depend on the duration of the day different in each world, and space translation of cities around the globe could be adjusted to a 24-hour cycle and on Earth, thus being more comfortable adaptation. Planets with excessive gravity and mass would be discarded to inhabit them directly, but turned moons around. Sightseeing trips or to collect minerals continue to be made, and thus a closer relationship with the planet would be maintained. Compact cities would be installed in space in an equatorial corridor, placing his exposed to the sun as they would on land, and ships to communicate the cities only have to change orbit, just up or down to accelerate or decelerate about them surface. Want back over a city would turn away the planet and thus would slow, want to accelerate descend and would approach the planet and thus would advance. The system of artificial gravity used would be the centrifugal type. Because my view is the most similar to the existing on Earth, I believe that human beings would adapt easily to him just as a sailor suits oscillations in a boat. Installation of cities in space could be useful not only for the worlds with low gravity, because this practice could become generally, and thus the typical problems would be avoided in planetary surfaces such as earthquakes, hurricanes, or excessive atmospheric pressures. A climate as the Earth is unusual and possibly its good weather will not last forever. This is an option that will be assessed in the coming times. Space cities would communicate with each other via smaller ships that addressed by the hangars located at its periphery, in order to prevent loss of the atmospheric gas contained therein at the time of exit. They would be equipped with a system compressors that would provide a state of vacuum, and so could be used. Gases for the following approach could also be used: cylinders connection with the ships with which it would be necessary to provide atmosphere around the hangar. Recycling systems will be essential for maintaining living conditions in space. Integrated system centrifugal. This gravity system would consist of multiple overlapping cylinders placed on each other and set in motion, generate force similar to Earth's gravity. I call integrated system for rotating cylinders would not be exposed to outer space as it would inside a fixed fuselage. The reason is very simple: so the ship on the outside have a normal, fixed aspect with respect to reference objects like planets, and inside could carry one or more primary cylinders oriented sense of direction. To be oriented forward, all g acceleration forces that could withstand the cylinders would apply in the same way on a bus on Earth, i.e. the acceleration and braking of the ship does not interfere with the gravitational force generated by moving cylinders. Each primary cylinder would turn multiple secondary cylinders inside, which, rotating each at different speeds, would be endowed to each of the same gravity. Closest to the axis cylinders would revolutions in less time in order to generate the same g forces. The outer, only the cylinder axis rule for living areas. Thus the ground would have a slight curvature, would increase in the nearest to the axis plants. However, passengers hardly notice it, as within each section or compartment only a fraction of the total curvature of the cylinder would occur, and also may straight plates used for the floor. Therefore, these spacesuits or all cities have a fixed structure and rigid outer and inner rotating multiple cylinders, one inside another, all oriented in that direction. The integrated centrifugal system is the gravity system that best resembles existing on Earth. From a scientific point of view could be said to be identical to Earth, but in reverse, is not a force that draws us inward, but a rotational force that drives us out, but limited within the cylinder. These two systems are somewhat serious and therefore siblings, as useful by one as the other. As for the effects on health or the balance of centrifugal movement, I think humans would adapt quickly and it would not matter. It is surprising that with the amount of research that has been done today in space has not yet been seriously addressed. Build a spacecraft equipped with centrifugal gravity systems, which allow occupants aboard a life better and more like the Earth. Each rotary plant would remain suspended in space without rubbing against one another, without using axes, to maintain its stability through a magnetic limiter's repulsion of like poles would see that each cylinder does not move from its site would be used. Rotary lifts. To maintain communicated each rotating rotary plant, elevators would also be used. These elevators would move both in a horizontal and vertical direction, can be placed in any of the mobile plant. Each certain distance the rotating cylinders would be cut across its section, for these elevators can move freely. Extendable rods by these lifts would rise and would decline, and progress would reach the speed needed to synchronize on each floor. Bus-type vehicles would be responsible for communicating the different rotational drums in the horizontal plane. This would require that one of the drums stop, and so thus to abandon it and move to the next. Spatial duplication. Inside a planet is common difference between what is situated above and which is located downstream, because gravity is directed in one direction, but in space this is different, so that the center of gravity of space is balanced. Masses could build cities or spaceships dual way, i.e. equally distributing their mass between its top and bottom. Although there might be not many differences in their foreign apparent aspect, with respect to a planetary ship, though it would be common for your top and bottom were very similar, some things could stay the same way, such as keeping the windows only on your part superior. It is a planetary spacecraft could be defined as the sum of a main volume topped by a dome, because in space is as if two of these ships by their bases would join, just as the Earth's gravity makes the planet just in all sides. However, it could give ships an aspect of verticality apparent, to make it more familiar. Thus a ship has a rotating drum of large gravity could center it in the middle of its structure and thus be easier to locate and deliver their masses with respect to the axis of gravity. Small craft. The system centrifugal gravity could also be used on ships smaller and even in cars. Some think this could unbalance the inner ear and balance system, but keep in mind that inside these ships occupants not notice the existence of the rotational movement of the drums. Also hitherto not been made any serious investigation thereon, i.e. never been built a rotational drum or been tested in humans for their effects. Craft adaptable. The shuttlecraft type, designed to communicate the planet's mothership or remaining a small car, could have serious adaptive mechanism, in order to be able to function both planets and space. For this purpose the gravity system would consist of a generally rotational drum in turn be divided into two sections or levels. The upper floor could rotate about its axis and thus on the planet would pointing upwards as the lower floor and space would rotate and would pointing to the axis of rotation of the drum. Thus in the space would benefit from the effects of centrifugal gravity and the planet would consistent with planetary gravity, for it would first have to stop the centrifugal drum. Logically movement. One could also choose not to include systems centrifugal gravity on small ships. To change the benefit would be to remove the uncomfortable curvature. In this case it would be visible by the small size of the drum and thus perfectly horizontal ground would anyway these ships could serve both the gravity of the planets as the mother ships in times of takeoff and landing. Craft verticales. Consideration could also be better vertical to all ships, meaning they would have a similar appearance to those operating on the ground in its external aspects. Therefore would consist of a main structure topped by a dome or higher structure like that they act on the surfaces of the planets. To do this, it would be necessary to overlap the rotating cylinders one above the other. Cylinders would be in the main structure and other on the upper structure. The disadvantage would be the loss of the mass balance which is achieved by duplication of structures, although that it does not mean that these ships is not possible. The various drums communicate with each other through a bus species remain weightless when moving from one drum to another since the centrifugal gravity only exists within them. Before leaving the drum in which the plant plugs that are would stop and so could go smoothly. In case you choose not to include the centrifugal gravity system on small ships, they could also be made completely vertical and the lack of gravity would be resolved with the installation of a system of magnetic gravity. Magnetic gravity. In my view the possibility of developing artificially force identical to the own natural on Earth gravity by force fields is highly unlikely. The proof is in the fact that throughout the evolutionary history of the Earth all biological forms have it developed multiple methods of propulsion electrical forces or other, but none of them have developed a field such a force to Earth's gravity, which is why my opinion is that in relation to methods of propulsion the most effective is the action end. Reaction mass and as for the system best suited gravity is the centrifugal type. Do not forget that the process of biological evolution is a great example of scientific progress in many fields of physics and chemistry, so it is reasonable to take this into account, but even if it were possible to have some drawbacks as the harmful influence of those force fields overall its purpose such interference would occur between the different fields have on each floor of a building. You could also place an attractive field under the city in order to generate artificial gravity, but the serious drawback loss progressive force in each plant the more removed the generator also would not be possible to disconnect the force field when it was not necessary as it would with the other system. For this reason the space centrifugal system seems more convincing. Regarding the use of centrifugal systems to provide surface gravity of moons and planets I think it would be ineffective because of the interference that would be caused by mixing planetary gravity and centrifugal. Cities would become filled structures cylinders with sections rotating half-hour half, that would be uncomfortable and the risk of breaking caused by gravity. Not forget that the centrifugal system in space is done by rotating drums in the weightless environment and therefore without the risk of breaking caused by Earth's gravity. Under these conditions it is best that the surfaces of the low-gravity world's magnetic systems are used to produce the attractive force required for the movement of people. This would be achieved by placing electromagnets or permanent magnets plates on the floor, but slightly below it, in order to disperse magnetism. By means of costumes provided sensitive magnetic field metal fibers it would be achieved providing people with sufficient attractive force to be able to walk with relative ease. This force field act primarily from the waist down and had one on each floor. In any case this system gravity is a method of supporting a gravity system itself. This system could also be used in those spacecrafts which for some reason is not deemed appropriate to use centrifugal system. Spatial rings. Compact cities would be located in a space ring at a distance in which the period of translation of the same around the planet or moon were equivalent to 24 hours, thereby day length would like on the surface. From my point of view, the best way to place the cities would be in a sort of chain in which the cities would line up around the equatorial zone. This place would be about 36,000 kilometers from the planet's surface, on call geostationary orbit. Space cities would place its top toward the Sun and thus would appear that they were on the Earth's surface, all occupy the same orbital plane relative to the Earth. Cities float separated from each other by an amount of not excessive kilometers. Some distance seem that we're forming a spatial ring. On Earth would be about 1,000 towns separated each by about 100 kilometers. To communicate with others, only a few cities would require transport ships put in a different orbit to the space occupied by the ring and thus would advance or recede with respect thereto. If move of the planet, ships recede with respect to the cities. If they approached the planet, ships would move about them. When they reached the city, they would want to go occupy the same orbital zone and then stops would be found regarding they. In order to avoid loss of planetary resources in spaceships, communication could be propelled photon energy, that is pure energy collected from the Sun. This energy has little angular momentum, but space is abundant and solves the problem of having to take the planet gases for use in propulsion. Other ways to solve the problem without resorting to the planet and get reaction mass would indefinitely use meteorites collected in space propulsion, but use them would be inconvenient because the space sully also to accelerate engine would become uncomfortable projectiles. Use space gases. Collecting devices would collect gases own space, which would then be used as a reaction mass. There are very few gases in space that can be collected, but if the engines of ships the accelerated to high speeds could make their journeys with little amount, plus you only need to give a slight boost to the ships and then these will effortlessly coast to their destination. Another option would be to use the gases produced by the Sun, which comes in the so-called solar wind. These collected gases alone could solve the problem. Collecting devices could be installed in the ring structure or in the lunar surface. What it is to use a system of energy indefinitely without having to consume the world's resources. But there would still be another way to avoid losing reaction mass in addition to better protect occupants of the ships and cities ring, would be to physically link the space cities by wires or tubes and build two areas of communication through tubes. Large dimensions allow the smaller ships passing from one city to the other without having to be exposed to outer space or dangerous solar radiation. These tubes completely encircle the planet at a distance and remain physically united cities. A tube would be placed at a certain distance below the cities and another would be placed on them, so the ships who were in those tubes occupy different orbits to cities and therefore have an offset with respect thereto. Other tubes communicated these with the central zone occupied by the cities. Turn these or would cover with a tight sphere, close the circuit, and thus all living areas would be protected and all reaction gases would be recovered except those used for communication with the planet. So the tubes can always take their place in space. A sort of fins with the solar wind would slow to accelerate or will be used. Thus the living conditions in space would be perfect, not being necessary to return to the planet than for tourism or for mineral resources. Sightseeing trips to the surface would be made only exceptionally because of its high cost. From the outside, these areas would cover cities or tubes that would join a transparent appearance, but could be an artificial effect, and would be built on solid materials several meters thick to withstand cosmic radiation and meteors. Between cities ring bases release ships the planet or outside, solar power stations, in charge of collecting the solar wind to the reaction mass of the craft, and spoilers maintainers rings be installed in its space area. Could also be installed artificial parks equipped with centrifugal gravity. Itself is not essential to go to the planet to see them. Advantages of living in space or Earth. Future societies will have to decide which is better, if you live in stable space stations in planetary orbit or live on the surfaces of planets or moons. Of course, planets with excessive gravity as Jupiter would be rejected, but instead its moons, which offer great expectations for future societies. These planets could, however, serve as a reserve gas for inhabited planets or to supply reaction mass to the interstellar ships. Each of these life forms has advantages and disadvantages without being very clear which is better. Living in orbit means to choose one wants gravity at will by using the rotational cylinder, and live on planetary surfaces means having the planet and its resources readily available without having to bridge the gap to the orbit. Prolonged stay in an environment with low gravity could cause loss of bone and muscle mass. This could be offset favoring the increase in stature of the inhabitants. This increase can promote muscle as a matter of kinetic mechanics would otherwise be reduced, minimizing the use of machinery and thus encouraging citizens to make maximal exercise. in space would be free from earthquakes, hurricanes, excessive atmospheric pressures, opaque atmosphere, or volcanic activities such as well as to synchronize its translation into a period of 24 hours, but the convenience of having the planet closer and accessible would be lost. In addition, magnetic gravity systems previously raised are not a genuine effective systems, rather are systems of auxiliary gravity, and although only were used for the moments of walking and moving, are not comparable to those of centrifugal type. It is also true that many planets and moons have their own gravity, and magnetic methods would only be a complement, albeit in low-gravity moons would highlight and could potentially be unpleasant. In any case, it is not entirely clear which method is best. Electromagnets or permanent magnetic plates would be placed on the floor, but slightly below to reduce its intensity. Permanent would be mainly in the areas usual walk, and electromagnets in areas such as housing where it is not necessary to operate continuously. The biggest flaw of this system is that only gravity acting on magnetism-sensitive materials and not on all. Another advantage of living on the surface of planets would be that there would not exist the risk of losing the reaction gases from the ships, to be caught by planetary gravity, thus could be used indefinitely. On planets and moons with low gravity and no atmosphere, the loss of these gases would avoid building a network of communication tubes and domes for cities connected to each other remain connected around the globe and completely sealed habitable zones. Chapter 4: Habits of Life in the Future. Energy. Oil reserves will not last indefinitely on Earth. Science will have to find a suitable replacement for energy. For some time, auto companies and others are looking for the solution to the problem and prepare their models for when this moment occurs. In my view, the solution is clear: you will have to resort to the same source that generated the above forms of energy, i.e. the sun, but in different forms such as wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, or produced panels photosensitive. Some say that this energy is inefficiently saying that the sun took millennia to accumulate the energy in oil and coal, but keep in mind that these reserves represent only a fraction of the energy that arrived on the planet and that was used in that time. It does not seem acceptable, for example, nuclear energy for use on Earth, because do not forget that this planet is an open ecosystem and therefore very sensitive to the risk of a radioactive leak. This energy is, however, the most appropriate in the interstellar travel, since among the stars does not reach the sun's energy, therefore it is the only one that can be used. From my point of view, is frivolous use of nuclear energy on Earth only because it is cheaper to produce. The consequences of accidents for humans should also be taken into account, and it is unacceptable that people in the next reactor's regions have to consider as a possible hypothesis having to leave their homes for years by a radioactive leak. Nor does it seem acceptable to use nuclear fusion energy on Earth, because it is based on the destruction of the hydrogen atoms of water for conversion into helium. I think you can solve the problem without the word destroy is taken to include in the process. Solar energy may accumulate by batteries or be transformed into liquid fuel using the water electrolysis process, by which oxygen and hydrogen atoms are removed. Once used as fuel, only leave as residue water vapor. In the desert areas of the Earth could be placed large installations of solar panels and windy areas in groups, and use the remaining systems. Clearly, having a source of unlimited and secure energy such as the sun, it is unnecessary to consider any other method to produce it. Costume single piece. In my opinion, in the future, the type of clothing that will be used will be easier than at present, essentially consist of a type of outfit that would call single piece by consisting of one piece with a central zip to open. This suit is similar to that used in factories by the workers, with a main structure of fabric with elastic waist, sashes, wrists, and ankles integrated into the garment. To be controlled in future cities' habit of dividing the suit into different sections in order to add or subtract clothing as the temperature there at all times of the day weather will no longer be necessary, because the temperature will remain constant throughout eventually. This would be one of the reasons for using these types of suits. Another reason would be to give a more homogeneous both the clothes and the whole society. Each person could choose the color or fabric, but wearing this suit would produce a sense of integration among all citizens' image. But the way using this costume will be gradual. You will surely be used in a generalized way through a referendum or vote. With this type of clothing, no longer would be difficult to decide what to wear. it is a simple garment that integrates all contained in one piece, and color, shape, and even color would be nothing more than an extension of the also homogeneous appearance of the human body. Each suit would have a different color, except in working clothes, they would use the same for all members of the same group. Things like flowers or pictures disappear from the dress, not have much to do with the human body covering, but work suits could have special badges and insignia or horizontal and vertical stripes. Double uniformity. Clothing common use would be to use two types of attire, one for the outside of the body we have said, and another consisting of underwear. These outfits would form a partnership with each other and encompass uses other, hence the name dual uniformity. Underwear, unlike the outside, would be formed by two pieces. Up would be a pole or short-sleeved shirt and neck, and down a brief order to better cool the body in case of rolling up or loose top. In a sense opposite, they would be as uniform, a single piece and not another, one of long limbs, and the other short, but form a good association with each other. This type of clothing would be commonly used, but there would be no ban on using other, they would simply be the result of a process of natural evolution in modes of dress. It could also raise the possibility of using costumes in one color but two pieces. In this case it would be pants down and a sweater or jacket for the top. In this case feel warm enough to take off his jacket, but it would more difficult to maintain uniform image. The preferably clear serious underwear and darker outside. Discarded options. Footwear. Things like high and pointy heels would make no sense for the continuation used in the future, being an aberrant and harmful way of footwear. Both men and women use the same type of suit and the same mode of footwear. As foreign human form, just it is different, and it makes no sense cause differences artificially without reason. The shoe will generally be similar to the type of sport today, but without laces and consistent with the look of the suit. Tie. Another absurd habit that will disappear will be the tie. This piece originally was intended to be a sort of reinforcement to protect the neck in winter, but later became an almost obligatory subject in certain social groups, and may be 40 degrees these groups in an almost robotic form, still without letting the useless object. It is unfortunate that sometimes the custom is to send about men and not the common sense and reason as the helm of their lifestyle. The cosmetics. Man strives to question the work of nature, and as a result cosmetics, paints, things like lips and eyes are another absurd habit of society emerged. The human body is perfect in nature and does not need to be intended to improve with these absurd paintings, is a sign of progress that have women realize this and tend to abandon it. The beauty should come from the qualities of each person and not the primitive paintings. As for the perfume, its purpose must be to avoid unpleasant odors and not to give the body a scent itself. It is better that people have a neutral odor more in keeping with its nature to provide another artificial. It should promote hygiene over the use of body scents, for example with showers and frequent silent, and underwear would move daily and abroad every week. Some appliances would dry the clothes by using hot air in a few minutes. Instead, fresheners are acceptable to provide pleasant odors where deemed appropriate. The jewelry. Human insecurity in itself, as well as the desire to appear more important than it is, gave as a result the appearance of the jewelry. This is a custom peculiar to backward societies that will surely disappear over time. It is necessary that people try to improve their own inner values and stop looking given more importance in an unreal way, as expressed with jewels, paintings or tattoos. Not that this evil be attractive, but these methods are objectionable because they try to distort human reality. Pets. Another custom that will disappear is to have pets in homes. For centuries man served them as a company or to assist in various tasks, but in the future this will no longer be needed, and the best way to thank would return them to their natural environment. Thereafter the animals will have some territories and places to live in freedom and without feeling threatened by people. The hair. In the future, as now, it will be normal that women take longer than men hair. Arguably its length is proportional to its femininity, as if it were a nonverbal language, so it is better than men take him short, but not too much. Rhythm schedules. Another way to improve the living habits and thus the health of people would be the implementation of a system of stable schedules so that the rhythms of day and night can switch in a harmonious way. Using reference hours or preferably stockings and keeping pace stably be achieved to improve the quality of life. Things like staying up late if you have a cause that justifies it leads to damage in the brain, besides being a little ecological attitude to underestimating the sunlight for part of the day. The job. Throughout time man has been concerned about how to reduce the excessive work with which it has had to perform many of the tasks of life and came to think that the work itself was inconvenient as such. However, raise the perfect society as a world without work is a big mistake, because the man in nature is actually done for that purpose. What is not acceptable is to think that life is to be devoted only to work, because the right thing is to consider work as a complement of life and not its sole raison d'etre. Another big mistake is to think that man at a certain time of life must be completely shirk the working world. This happens because it looks too much work as little as an obligation and a rich complement of life. Work is necessary for the full realization of the person regardless of age you have. The body needs a certain amount of exercise each day to stay healthy. When retirement becomes idle, the consequence is death, not only because the harm posed by the lack of body movement, but also the feeling of worthlessness that many elderly acquire in that situation. It is a fallacy to say that we will exercise dancing or walking, because one is not born to engage in those simple functions. The greatest need are not squeezed out of the labor market, but it is also necessary to make this world a more humane environment that considers the welfare of the workers as their top priority. For older people could allocate jobs as rangers or support new workers, would be tasks where productivity is not a priority, so his life would be more enjoyable. In any case, the task would be voluntary, unpaid, and in line with the health status of each person. At the end of the day, the goal of life is to seek happiness, and work well run is one of the instruments to achieve this. A certain amount every day can be a good antidepressant, is one of the major life activities of human being, but also an essential form of natural stimulus. Integrates work, entertains and provides an occupation. It would be illogical a future in which they tried to eradicate something so useful. The holidays. It is fair and reasonable that after several days of work right to have public holidays, but as an aberration interference is done with them in the calendars of some countries. Collate holidays in the middle of the workweek only causes disruption of the activity without any reason. Weeks must have 5 working days of 8 hours each, or 6 days and 6 hours, and only in the case of holiday periods weeks or months would be used. Excuses to stop labor activity in the middle of the week is harmful to both people and businesses, and the fact prevent this does not mean that it will have to work longer hours, because that is calculated differently. The companies. In my opinion, in the societies of the future will not exist today rivalries between left and right, because this way of understanding the economy and politics will disappear. The market economy that gives advantage to competitiveness on an economy system type communist prevail, as the most dynamic and effective companies give better response to citizens' demands are those that must prevail, as this is what leads to progress of themselves and their workers. The private economy is more effective than other methods because, in an effort to improve its products and therefore their purchasing power, companies improve the society they serve and their workers. But that should not lead to neglect the needy. Some believe that support private enterprise comes with being cruel to the poor, but actually fight for the eradication of poverty is the best way to ensure the existence of privileges, if those who do not want to feel threatened. In the near future you happen to have 2 groups or social classes. One would be formed by the leading sectors as politicians and businessmen, and other formed by the working class. Eventually the salaries of these 2 groups will increasingly similar, to lose the fear of poverty, which is the origin of some fortunes, but also because given less importance to personal and more profit to the development of human values, this process will be a gradual and voluntary basis. Therefore the third group, the indigent, would disappear by implementing birth control policies and migratory movements. In addition, there will be a certain indefinite strike by anyone stay unassisted in the case of losing your job. This grant will consist of a number of small but enough to live money. It is better to give a little help to many a great help. Just also large unemployment benefits do not contribute to stimulate the desire to work. In exchange for the unemployed are obliged to accept job offers that the state provide them. An evolved society is one that guarantees its citizens basic rights such as health, work and housing, but always with consideration for the beneficiaries. such as being willing to accept the jobs offered by the state or enforce control laws. Birth would limit the number of children to 2 per couple in most cases. These measures would be needed to avoid depletion of social resources that after all are the key to a society in which all basic needs they are satisfied. The money. In the future, the use of banknotes and coins disappear and exist only money based on electronic methods such as credit cards. The hypothesis to think of a world without money is not logical, since it would not be possible to distribute products equitably and that would avoid wastages. However, disappear inflation, as prices will have a constant value based on its quality and not speculative interest. The salary would be introduced in the income citizens and credit card. Everyone could use it without having to handle the annoying coins. This would benefit mainly supermarkets that charge should not ask or give cash. Unions and strikes. In the future, wildcat strikes they disappear, because it is the result of a political approach, in which priority is given the right to strike on citizens to have their basic needs met. It will not treat both consider what must be the minimum service to be, but to be certain key occupations that will not have recognized such a right, because it is vital services that an interruption of their business however small can cause major damage to society. Services such as the army, police, hospitals, cleaning, transportation and politics would not have recognized such a right. To change these professions may have some committees that directly negotiate their working conditions with the government, but always from a position of respect for the law. Unions in this context without left nor right nor wildcat strikes will have to evolve towards a more oriented law in the legal profession and less towards citizen protest in the streets approach. Unions sometimes claims employers are presented as if they had unlimited resources and fail to recognize that ultimately those resources are paid by the workers themselves that it claims to defend. Such unions should be the first to promote it employees who work more against those who, in order to prevent fraud, which basically is a way of injustice among the workers themselves, are rewarded for it. A useful system would be deducted up to 15 days of vacation or the equivalent annual salary. In the case of low whose motive is not working, or reward more vacation days to workers who have not taken casualties. With these passive safety systems would no longer be necessary to have a large number of inspectors to check the bona fides of citizens, since to do so it would be an economic system that would encourage them not to consider fraud as a form of enrichment and all workers would benefit. Governance. In the future, the government systems of today will disappear to make way for genuine democracy, in which citizens support only when a law in a majority this will succeed. The current political model emerged as a tool to snatch landowners and feudal lords the power-wielded absolute form and give it to the new form of power that represented the bourgeoisie, but this social revolution required the support of the people to make it possible. This is how emerged the current political parties and parliamentary monarchies. But this form of democracy is clearly ephemeral to only allow citizens to participate in power once every 4 years, but only to choose a leader. Why politicians exacerbate the aggressiveness of citizens against other parties and so once lose its capacity for independent vision, choose to vote for one or the other, thus nullifying all his power until the next elections. True democracy will be in the future will be the choice of every law, which can be done easily through internet or other means. False disputes between left and right in which nothing of what is said is true is finished and only the humiliation of hand and power obtaining sought. Each month the state will issue a bulletin with all laws wishing to approve, and only in the event that most citizens give approval these laws will do well. The power struggles will no longer be necessary because there will be no power to achieve, because the final decision to approve each and every one of the laws is in the hands of citizens. Comfortably and from home may cast their vote via the internet. For agree with the proposed state, simply do nothing and the process will continue, but disagree may be indicated on the form will contain all new laws to pass. In the future there will be no monarchy, as it is in direct contradiction with the principle of equality of all citizens before the law. All political positions are open to all citizens. The monarchy had felt in the past in societies where nations they were small and simple systems of government and not given to equality. In the future but only a political approach towards justice and equality of citizens' rights will prevail. At the international level will favor the existence of a common language and a government of the United Nations unprivileged in the vote as it exists now, in which some countries have a veto rights that refuses to others. vote in this place will be by majority vote and the seat can rotate among all races and continents. Healing. Surely in the future or guaranteed free health will be extended to all citizens of the planet. In the background, the governments of some countries that do not include this right try to believe that unassisted is as if they were not citizens of the same country, but the exclusion does not help the progress of societies. Every citizen of a country or a city should be considered as part of the whole system and therefore have both the labor market and in health. Food. Gradually, society will go to an approach based on an exclusively vegetarian or said feed otherwise a diet that does not include meat into its components food. It is logical that a world evolved to choose the type of food that opts for a pacifist attitude excludes death without animals as one of your choices. This would desirable plant foods were produced with similar to animal type characteristics. It is a myth to think that diet should include animal protein strength, because nothing is less the type of plant. Some people to avoid a scientific and objective analysis of the question seeks to use alleged medical reasons to justify, but there is no real reason that prevents a plant food, since both proteins and vegetable fats have nothing to envy of origin animal. In addition, some studies indicate that vitamin B12 can be produced naturally by the body. The myth of the flesh has only led the West to become an obese society and it would be done with it. Sweet and salty. It is also a mistake to think that a diet that excludes salt or sugar is better, since these two elements are essential in the diet. Salt enhances the body and sugar mind. Salt is involved in bone formation and in the production of the necessary blood pressure for life, and sugar arguably is the fuel of mind, since it is with sugar with nerve impulses that control the body and the important brain activities occur. Certainly there are people who for a certain disease cannot consume more than in small amounts, but it is wrong to deny the merit and importance to health. As in many other things, food, moderation is the best option. Future food. Once you start with the colonization of the moons and planets, possibly will begin with the widespread production of totally artificial foods. This does not mean that these foods consist of pills or something, since they will be virtually identical to the previous ones and with similar nutritional properties. The digestive system has certain requirements and food have to adapt to them. In the future, the process of providing home's necessities like food no longer involve taken to move continuously to supermarkets, because with the installation of a small forklift, homes of these products will be provided simply ordering on a computer. Some departments located in the same buildings are responsible for sending automatically. Cycles of meals. In my opinion, food is divided into a cycle of 4 meals all day, 2 large and 2 small that alternately and harmoniously happen, i.e. the breakfast is a light meal will follow, the midday meal will be greater, and most small snack dinner. It is true that large meals necessarily have to coincide with big jobs, since the body can accumulate energy. It is also pernicious work and food match at the same time, for the digestion process. The judicial system. In the future, the judicial system will be designed in order to be a service for the citizen rather well as an instrument of state. Convictions have crimes is life imprisonment added to correspond to the sum of crimes committed when they were perfectly feasible. There will be no extenuating circumstances for those who commit crimes while intoxicated, since every adult is responsible for his actions and therefore is able to not make them, and if they have an addiction problem, ask for help, because first is vice and after the addiction. Also, there is the possibility that a criminal a profit or compensation for damages suffered during the commission of a crime, since it is one thing to punish a law enforcement officer or a victim molest him and quite another to encourage financially to the criminal, which would become an act in favor of crime. Nor is it logical that prisoners considered as a burden for the state. It is right that in all prisons workshops with which prisoners pay expenses that may cause further to compensate the victims are installed. Weapons. It is reasonable to think that eventually the weapons will disappear from the Earth's surface, or at least reducing their amount. Once the planet completes its political unification, will no longer have felt the old national rivalries that were one of the reasons for its existence. 2. The world's progress towards a more humanistic social model could contribute to this. Nuclear energy should be relegated solely for strategic deterrence and rejected in use for propulsion of ships or submarines. Because to do so they can be used without any problem other fuels with lower risk, it is regrettable that arranged and inexhaustible energy such as solar, man problems is sought using nuclear energy. This energy should only be used in interstellar travel because it is the only place where solar energy does not come. But in space, it is likely that conflicts may take a little longer to disappear because of the territorial problems that may arise in the process of distribution and colonization of the solar system. This happened previously when European nations strove to keep the peace, but foreign disputes occurred over control of the colonies. It would be desirable that in this case the process of colonization of the planets is done in a more unbiased and objective. Stun guns. It is also regrettable that today weapons of crippling type are so underdeveloped. There are many conflicts in which these weapons could be used and make it easier the work of law enforcement without requiring resorting to the classic deadly weapons. In cases like flight of the offender or aggression, these weapons could solve the situation without bloodshed or fight. A model could be a gun that would have two parallel chargers, one would have normal bullets and the other stun bullets. These bullets would consist of a liquid anesthetic. Darts once give your target would cause loss of consciousness within seconds and several minutes later would the effect. The use of these weapons would make the work of the police more humane and less dangerous for them as citizens, both as the world evolves towards the end desirable crime. Chapter 5, Some Metaphysica. The origin of the cosmos. In this chapter I will try to explain my point of view as has been the process of evolution of the cosmos to the present and also the future holds. The beginning. At the beginning of the cosmos there was no time, so talking about it would not be too accurate. In order for the necessary time no material particles in motion, because it is the change of location of these particles that creates the existence of a past. At first, he would be out of time, only exist emptiness, but emptiness alone cannot exist, because no one can have no sense of self. You need a mirror in which contrasted to be considered as something like reflection and extreme opposite of nothingness or emptiness came the first material particle. This is more a fact of physics that something that happened at a given moment, explains the primordial essence of matter, but cannot find its beginning in time, since space and matter have always existed and cannot exist without each other, because they are the same thing but in reverse. Therefore is more to explain what is the essential nature of the cosmos to explain what was its origin in time, for the same cosmos that matter is neither created nor destroyed, only transformed. From these two elements are space and matter, bipolarity of the cosmos, and the origin of the sexes, or rather the source polarities and binary models then they derive them arises. From here, the first particle is divided into multiple particles would have given a different beings and different personalities in the cosmos and act separated without direct connection with each other. It must be emphasized that life is eternal to the particles and for space, and that all processes are cyclical, and once completed, the time starts from the beginning again. These first particles are divided into two groups, one majority that is what formed the spirits that later would become the people and animals, and another formed by planetary beings, which is to be responsible for forming the planets and stars. These planetary beings are the backbone of the cosmos and those responsible for it to work on your physical plane. These beings are not superior to others and only corresponded them that function as a matter of circumstances, because in principle could be reversed, which will happen probably in the next cosmic cycle. These planetary beings simply do not run the planets as that they are planets and govern from the atomic level to the movement of the stars. In this context, God would be the truth above all exists in this process, and the set of laws that govern the universe. These laws emanate from all beings that form, but are planetary beings who shape them. Mainly these beings yet do not act only on the mineral plane in which they are, and do not interfere with human. Arguably the planetary beings are like super-concentrated spirits because all the material forming the planets is part of them. Of course the planets are also alive, but no organic type but mineral type beings. It is a fallacy to say that matter begets life but not life, can only beget life-living things. Each atomic particle, each chemical molecule moves and have activity because they are an expression of the life led inside. Planets whose mission is to be the support on which subsequent biological and organic beings are developed in order to live as evolved life possible, which would be achieved through the incarnation of existing spirits in the form of plants and animals. It is by this fusion between spirit and matter as spirits reach their maximum embodiment and therefore is performed. The process of life and death is nothing more than a repetitive cycle that in no case involves the death of the spirit, because life is eternal for all matter and life in its essence. Arguably the reason for life is the pursuit of happiness, and the process of reincarnation in matter helps to get. Death only mission is to regenerate the spirits with a new birth, thus it starts at the beginning again. Not only learning helps progress, also oblivion does. The question is that you should forget and know. A person dying forgets his knowledge, but the whole society retains necessary for new generations. Instead, the spirit has a memory that is disabled by incarnating, but it helps you in the process after each death. Why are ephemeral work of those who seek eternal life of the body, by doing that are trying to deny the cyclical nature of the cosmos and its right to renew itself, besides being a clear rejection of the eternal life of the spirit. The first particles. All particles that form part of one being or spirit, may be linked by filaments that communicate with each other and that would move at the speed of light, in order to avoid collision with other filaments other beings, i.e. rotatable filaments would move and surround the others that coincide to not interrupt their march. These strands would be composed of the primary material has no particles in it and are the true atoms. The nature of the spirit. Arguably the spirit essentially consists of a cluster of atoms similar characteristics to those already known, which are taken from ordinary matter. The difference is that inside lies what we might call soul, i.e. particles not formed by any other particle but not necessarily indivisible and joined together, whose sole function is to feel and make decisions that are the true nature of being. The conglomeration of atoms surrounding it simply acts as a complement like the body, but that comes after death and facilitate the soul qualities action, memory, and displacement. The function of the spirit is therefore act as an intermediary between the soul and the body and contains qualities of both. The solar system training. After the expanded explosion great matter through space they began forming nebulae powder which then arise stars, and the grouping of these galaxies. The first stars used to be giants and easily broke flooding the space more complex atoms. The grouping of the supernova dust resulted in the formation of our solar system. At first, around the Sun thousands of small planets with highly unstable elliptical orbits that are continually crossed with those of the other planetoids were formed. This orbital instability led to the collision and continued destruction of these small planets and the formation of the rich asteroids Iron. According to planetoids they were getting bigger, absorbing other smaller planetoids and acquired a more stable circular path. Starting here today planets emerged. The more mass has a larger planet is its orbital stability, thus the planetoids were continually falling into the other major planets attracted by its gravity and so the space was left in the current situation, with a small number of planets but orbits very stable. Biological evolution. In principle Darwinian theories of evolution they are not necessarily wrong because the competition among the different animal and plant species are an essential component in this process. However, that does not mean you can explain everything based on these unique concepts. It is the union between spirit and matter which began the process of biological evolution and the wishes of the spirit that shaped these forms. The competition between the animals creates a natural selection, but from within the spirit which defines and guides. Arguably the spirit and the influence of natural selection are divided into biological progress by 50% each and the natural environment we know is therefore the sum of the influence of the two. Eventually man will colonize all the planets of the solar system and the surrounding stars, until all spirits embodied in animal and plant forms pass into human form. Then begin a process of desertification and plants disappear from the Earth's surface. Unlike humans or higher animals, plants or bacteria have an individual but group spirit, i.e. one spirit control entire groupings of these beings. About 20,000 worlds will be colonized by this process and against what is thought now climates or different severities of different planets will not be an obstacle to achieve this. It is a misconception that the worlds with a climate like Earth are the ones who used to live, since the use of compact cities and the advanced technology of the future man can adapt and find protected from these different climates. It will not be to adapt the climate of these planets to man, but to build cities and facilities that preserve this of them. Think for example in changing the Martian climate with bacteria is a naive, always idea and when you can build domes and protected cities with their own atmospheric pressure, it is logical to seek first the most practical and simple solutions and then the other. Does not make sense pretend to be other planets like the Earth, we must accept them as they are, but creating cities and appropriate facilities for men. Of course only uninhabited planets must be colonized, since only a minority of them generates biological life. These initiators worlds of organic life, we could call them original planets, and logically we must respect them to complete their own evolution. In colonial worlds both food and oxygen would be artificially synthesized in the inner cities, and the man thus no longer need the plants as intermediaries between themselves and the mineral medium. Competition among animals. Some think that among the animals there is only instinct and act impulsively, but do not forget that within each animal there is a brain and ability to think like humans. Animals can also distinguish between good and evil and act in a selfish way, but unlike the man did not pose things to, are decided quickly but aware of what they do not have ability to think but to reason, use what might be called pre-thought. In these circumstances predation among animals it is not a mandatory option, since it is rather a choice made by them for convenience. However, because of natural selection is just becoming need to adapt to this unique form of subsistence. In these circumstances, the fact of having many offspring is a response of dams to prevent their extinction and not a whim. If no predation, animals would have to regulate their birth to fewer. This is the reason why man today is becoming a threat to other species and for himself, for his lack of self-criticism and its limited ability to curb their population explosion. There is look for more food to feed more people. It is about having the right number of people that the planet is able to withstand, without denying animal and plant species rightful space. To break down dead animals, nature invented bacteria and other means which ensure reduction to the essential chemical principles, although predation is also involved in it. Difference between man and animals. The same animals that man has a spirit and a certain intelligence capability, however, their inventiveness is limited and therefore are different. Each animal is as representing a stage in the process of biological evolution. Man alone represents the top where there is nothing but what he is capable of achieving, is therefore the man in charge of opening new frontiers in the way of biological progress. The evolution of the stars. From my point of view, the man will remain indefinitely with the planets in the solar system, regardless of the evolution of the sun. Eventually, this star evolve into a red giant and then a white dwarf, but this does not mean an end because from my point of view, it is then passed to their longer lifespan. It will emit less power but more stable and durable. Scientists think that our star will grow as a result of the fusion of atoms of carbon and iron inside, and as a result the Earth will be destroyed in about 5,000 million years, but in my opinion, when the Sun reaches such a degree all that expansion be able to achieve this planet is a bubble of gas and solid particles driven by the solar wind. Therefore it is highly questionable that in such a degree of dispersion of its mass can be considered threatened a planet like Earth. Is more, I doubt that this process of heating the star reaches destroy Mercury. The bad thing about science is that all too often a hypothesis of a scientist is usually discarded by other major hypothesis of another, and finally it teaches us not myth and try to use his teachings to improve ourselves, but without necessarily consider them as absolute truths which cannot be improved. Scientific progress is a succession of ideas in which some are abandoned by erroneous or outdated, but in which there are always other true that justify the sense of progress and science. The sun in the process of red giant will expand and bubble incandescent material could reach the ground, but may be very sparse so also harmless, but the inhabitants of the nearest planets, the sun will have to abandon them until this process is complete, and solar temperature drops. Once the sun acquires its final appearance of white dwarf, these planets will again occupy and its inhabitants will live in them until the end of the cosmic cycle in about 80,000 million years. Solar panels collect large energy that still remains the sun in close orbit to its own surface and then sent to the planets by lasers. Supergalaxias. It makes about 15,000 million years evolution of the cosmos began with a huge explosion that threw the whole mass with which galaxies form after a seemingly indefinite spherical expansion. But from that moment the matter began to be attracted by this gravitational force on each atom. This force was originally dedicated to forming nebulae of dust, then planets and stars formed and with them the galaxies, but this force of attraction not end there since its inexorable fate will be the gradual merging of galaxies, which does not mean shock, because after the union of black holes that form their cores, larger galaxies bigger and stars of both will be formed, will find an orbital point in which stand and follow their evolution. Similarly, the expansion of the cosmos will eventually stop and begin to reverse. Galaxies already merged are again merged with other super-galaxies, and this process will not end until the end only stay a super-galaxy that contains them all, and turn this super-galaxy will decline to the nucleus to form a new cosmic egg with all matter contained therein. After a regeneration process will explode and start a new cosmic cycle. This could occur within about 80,000 million years. Colors of numbers. This is an issue we would consider today unpublished or little studied, and that has to do with the intimate relationship between the different parts of the physical universe. Although it may be surprising, each color it can be associated with a number, thus 0 would be white, the black 1, the 2 red, 3 yellow, 4 red, 5 gold, 6 blue, 7 brown, 8 9 red and light blue. We must not confuse the metaphysical relationship between colors and numbers with synesthesia, because this is just a biological anomaly. In the background all matter is related, and this is a science that is developing. If the intimate nature of things is studied, can reach better understand their rationale. For example, the number 0 symbolizes space and female values cosmos, also it represents the extent in the horizontal plane. Along with this one are a binary relation in multiple universal aspects. The number 1 closely related concepts, as the point is in the center of a circle, also represents matter, male values, and extension in the vertical plane. As central circle can also be associated with the control elements, or the head and crest represent music, and 0 depression. Number 2 is directly related with polarities in the universe and the origin of the sexes. Because of its proximity to 1 may be associated with power and masculine, it could also be said to be the sum of 0 and 1. The number 3 represents the beginning of a complex association between various individuals and allows you to create a larger base structure and a lower top by the triangle. Being green in the middle of the electromagnetic spectrum between red and blue, also it represents the balance between the forces of nature. The number 4 symbolizes the beginning of the same rigid and symmetrical structures. The number 5 symbolizes wisdom and most complex spherical shape, and in turn be related to the number 1. The number 6 represents the beginning of spiritual values. The number 7 is an ambiguous number that combines the others in its features, like add 5 and 2. The number 8 is like 4 but twice. The number 9 is 6, evolution towards a more spiritual form on the eve of completing the cycle. Thus the low numbers also represent the lower colors in the electromagnetic spectrum, and high numbers the highest spectrum. The white light symbolizes justice and truth and is the sum of all colors. The black color symbolizes the void, rest, night, but can also be associated with the number 1 and evil, but not necessarily, it depends on the circumstances. The color red symbolizes energy, green symbolizes life, and the blue color symbolizes spiritual values. Just as a person's feet would be related to the red, green waist and head with blue. Male and female. These values I show for numbers and colors are not absolute but relative, because depending on what level of the cosmos are displayed, they may appear apparently reversed. So number 1 is black like space that can be associated with 0 being white. It is something that depends on the circumstances. Feminine values would be space, water, silence, cold, the earth to the sun, the gap with respect to the subject. Masculine values would be the heat, the sun, the crest on a musical note, but the concept of male or female depends on regarding it arises. For example, the sun is masculine with respect to land, this turn around, but the stars are suns revolve around the galactic core and about him are feminine, are not contradictions but different planes. Another example would bipolarity, such as represented by the salt and sugar in food. Salt represent male values and would be represented by the color red, sugar and represent female values would be represented by the color blue. So I say that philosophy is the most difficult and less evolved science there today, so is the one most improved in the future. Scientists' myths. Hibernation. From my point of view, is outrageous to think that to make long journeys through space, you will have to resort to freezing of people as if they were canned. Not forget that preserves people are dead and no This belief arises from the mistake of believing that space travel must last as long as a bus ride. The solution for these long journeys through space is the shipbuilding city, which allow the stay in space for long periods of time. Not forget that in every person there is a spirit that does not have to be locked in a body. In such conditions, bear in mind that the spirit needs constant activity. This is the cause of sleep. We dream throughout night, although we do not agree. The reason is that memory records memories in a different frequency when we sleep when we are awake, so when we will wake up we realize what we were dreaming at the time. Teleportation. Another mistaken belief in my opinion is the teletransportation, breaking each molecule consisting of the body and then rebuild them in another point in space. This belief stems from the existence of machines such as fax that allow sending an image through a telephone system, but do not forget that in this case what is sent is the electronic image of the object and not the object itself. It is totally absurd to think that a body which has taken many years to form and evolve, can break down and rebuild again without difficulty. Devices such as fax send what is energy and not matter, that's the difference. Nature invented precisely the movement to save the problem of distances. Powers of mind. Telepathy. Another belief in my view wrong to think that the man of the future will possess powers like telepathy or telekinesis is the ability to speak for mental waves or moving objects without touching them. I believe these qualities are rather typical of the spirit and not the body. What happens is that sometimes procedures fail and go beyond where they should be. Videncia. As for clairvoyance and precognition, these qualities can rely heavily on intelligence and sensitivity of people as what determines the extent to which they can develop. Not forget that this is a predictable world and does not have to surprise. The world follows a trajectory determined by an inertia that to some extent can be predicted just as meteorologists predict the weather. Another clear example is the ability of scientists to predict what the stars will happen within several million years. All this is explained by the tendency of nature to follow a logical path. Reading of thought. I think it makes no sense to think that in the future reading of thought as such is possible. However, it is well known that it is possible to know to some extent the mood of a person or even figure out what you're thinking just knowing the meaning of facial features, to some extent a close relationship with his personality. Although facial features you orient knowledge of people, that does not mean you can say what everyone is thinking. This is a quality that can be higher or lower depending on the intelligence and sensitivity of each person. Travel in time. Another belief in my view wrong are the time travel. It is absurd to think you can change the location of it for the simple reason that the time is not more than the ability to remember the position of matter in their positions above. Whenever the matter moves generates a past, and the future is not only the different positions that matter will take in its motion. As then it will be possible for a person journey into the past, whether that past no longer exists, for matter that formed is the same as we have today. What is possible however is time travel indirectly, that is a man of today hypothetically could rise to a skilled spaceship to go to other planets inhabited, but at an earlier stage than ours, and then it's like I was making a journey through time. So if you travel to a planet that were within the age of the dinosaurs would be like a trip to that time in this planet. Spatial foldings. Some think that space can be folded like rubber, and so spacecraft could take a trip between 2 points without traversing the space between them, but in my view that argument does not make sense for the fact that no, it is logical search space properties that are rather of matter, because the void is precisely the opposite of this. So things like kinking, folding, or perforations are features that are not applicable to it, and who thinks that's because it is not able to assume that in regard to the duration of space travel is not correct to approaches of days or hours but years. The robots. Today there controversy both among science fiction writers as by some scientists about whether robots eventually came to be identical to people with the same characteristics. I believe this is due to a materialistic vision of human being, for those who think and consider people as mere conglomeration of matter and forget that within each person there is a spirit that makes him different from any machine. So the robots will never become as people, and also that the future will be a world without humanoid robots. Reptilian humanoids. This is a hypothesis that is not so far-fetched, because in those Earth-like but with excessive temperature planets, it seems unlikely the evolution of species to a form of intelligent life but reptile, that is cold-blooded, but I think probably because the land could have gone that way with reptiles left after the last extinction of species and yet did not. This extinction was probably caused by a meteorite that crashed into the Gulf of Mexico about 65 million years ago. I believe that progress towards the forms evolved as human beings requires a lower temperature and biological development of a mammalian type. Maybe that's the reason that did not occur previously. I would also like to emphasize that in my view, only the human form and carbon biology will succeed in the various inhabited planets, because I think it is the most successful of all, and the development of man is not a coincidence but something intended by the nature. Although other inhabited worlds had any difference with the Earth, the result of evolution would develop much like us humans. My conclusion is that only Earth-like worlds are accepted by nature to biological evolution, and human form only prevail for being the best. Possibility of life on Mars. I think Mars would have been an inhabited planet as the Earth if not for its low gravity. About 500 million years ago the planet had rivers and seas, but gradually lost them because the cessation of volcanic activity stopped producing steam and almost all he had left evaporating into space. Omnipotence of science. Some think that scientific progress give man unlimited possibilities and nothing to be proposed will be impossible to realize. This is a mistaken belief that the progress of science aims at the full realization of man in the cosmos. That is not the same as get everything you want. The same way that an organ is part of a body, man is part of the universe but cannot do everything. The frantic pace of progress today will not last forever and in the future will be slower. When this happens there will be amazing things that have been done and instead others never be achieved. It could be said that man get science half of what will be hypothesized at the outset, but instead get everything that you help them reach their full realization as being the cosmos evolved. It should be borne in mind that scientific progress is based on the use of physical and chemical properties of matter, and this in turn has rules that govern it, and limiting the consequences can be drawn from it. Scientific progress is aimed at full self-realization of man, and when this process ends the pace of evolution is slow. Keep in mind that not everything is possible with science but as much that can be achieved with it. Man at the end of progress. Over the last 20 years I have dedicated myself to try to understand the universe that surrounds me, conducting research both in terms of classical physical sciences as philosophically. My conclusion is that all the most complex is to try to understand as they should raise the issues surrounding the man. This is not a coincidence, because the man is the goal of all the progress of nature and more complex suit, and is the man who is at the end of evolution. Try to analyze things like which must be clothing or the rhythms of meals philosophically may be more complex to analyze the evolution of stars. The reason is very simple and is not about deciding to chance this sort of thing, but to understand the metaphysical circumstances that govern, such as those that determine the double uniformity and suits single piece. Man is in pinnacle of evolution and its raison d'etre is therefore normal that the surrounding circumstances are more complex. Epilogue. My intention in doing this book is to try to correct the imbalance from my point of view between the so-called physical sciences and philosophy. I think this is the least developed science today and the one that has to contribute to humanity in the future. Scientists cling to the science known in a way that borders on materialism and fear into the world of the hypothetical as a way to explain what they do not understand. Philosophy is responsible for providing possible solutions to unresolved problems, but the demonstration process is more complex. It makes no sense to reject the role of philosophy in society just because they can be inserted into a glass jar. An ideological reasoning may be considered sufficient for one person but not for another. It may depend a lot on their culture but also their intelligence. However, the courage of scientific is its ability to accept the improbable as possible without denying any hypothesis, without analyzing it impartially. It would be too much to expect that all my theories are true, but some of them, if only it were, it would be a step forward for humanity, and for this alone would be justified because the creation of this book. Finish.